Hello YouTube! This is the second video in my series on how to make a ring with a prong setting like this using Delft clay casting. The thing that makes this video special is that, as far as I can tell, it's the only video on YouTube for three-part molds with Delft clay for jewelry specifically. Of course, I'm not the only one using this technique, I just can't find a tutorial for it. I'm not an expert on this, so I'm sure there will be things people see that they think can be done better and differently. If so, please comment and share your knowledge. I'm really just trying to expand knowledge in the community a little bit. What else? This ring is particularly difficult to make with this technique because of all the things sticking off of the edges. If you get to the final product and see all the bits of metal that I later have to take off with a Dremel, don't be too discouraged. If you make one that's like this and has a bunch of straight edges on it, with or without this little gap that I left for style purposes, then you can make it a lot closer to the final product and not have to spend hours and hours dremeling. Last thing, I do have this ring linked on Etsy. This is very much a hobby, not a business, and most of my stuff never even goes to Etsy. But I would like to at least pay for some of my equipment if there's things I don't have a friend or relative that I'm sending them to. With that, on to the video. Now we move on to the actual Delft clay part of the Delft clay casting. The basic idea, of course, is that I'm going to fill this with Delft clay, take the model, pack the model in there, take the model out, and then pour silver into the space that's left. It's not incredibly important for this part to have a fine surface because of the way in which I'm going to do this. You'll see why later. But I do want it to be at least okay. So we're going to force the ring into this half of the mold kind of butt first. And because of that, you don't want it to be completely tight. You want it to be just tight enough that when you press on it, it gives it a little bit. Okay, that feels about right. Maybe a little bit more here. Okay. We're going to take this off. Okay, that's about right. Now we're going to take some parting powder and spread it around like this. I don't want it all over my board mixed in with the stuff I got there. It should look about like that when you're done. Not too much excess. I'll take this thing that I spent hours and hours on. Sorry guys, a little bit of an edit here. I realized I didn't say anything about these wood cores while I was making the original video. Basically, you'll need to make a core, round piece of wood or something similar that fits neatly inside the model. This is true whether you make the model out of graphite or something else. This is going to be the guide, as you'll see later, for how to make the sand core. The important factor that I want you to remember is that this determines the inside diameter of the ring, even more than the inside diameter of your model. This is the determining factor. So you'll need to measure this carefully and make the outside diameter of this very slightly larger than the final inside diameter of your ring. I personally do 0.5 millimeters larger than what I want the final to be, but It depends on how close you want to get and how much file work you want to do. Let's put this here. Let's decide on our orientation first. It needs to go in straight because it's going to come out straight. Force it in. And we'll check from the side. Looks about right. Check from the other angles. Force it in some more. Getting there. We're trying to get this so that the wood core is halfway submerged in the delft clay. Almost, not quite. And after each time I push it down, I check to make sure that the prongs are directly pointed up. Angle's still correct. Is that halfway? Looks like halfway. Now what I've done is completely covered the entire thing with parting powder. And I'm going to stuff it in all these little cracks between the model and the core. And the reason for this is that you don't want the delft clay to get into those same cracks and then tear on the way out. A tear is always going to be larger than the thing that caused the tear, and you don't want it to leave a big huge gap. Alright, so we got this nice area of white here. Don't want it quite that big because anywhere where the parting powder is, it's going to keep the delft clay from being in the same place. Okay, that looks about right. Maybe a little bit of excess still here. Anywhere where there would otherwise be a dark gap underneath is where you want some of the parting powder. Okay. Okay, so on this side, it matters a lot what kind of delft and what texture of delft you're putting on. So I'm actually going to put my sifter over here and make sure to knock off any hard pieces on the bottom. And then start putting fine delft all over the model. And then once you get the whole thing covered, it starts to matter a lot less. Okay. Now you may recall that when we first did this, we didn't pack the bottom very tight. And that has a consequence. Consequence being that when I pack this side tight, it's going to force the part line of the delft clay past the part line of the metal part of the mold. So the way we get around that is you leave a little bit there. In fact, I think I'm going to pack some more around the outside here. And you turn the entire thing over, and you essentially pack it from two sides simultaneously by putting more on the underside after you've partly packed the top. You have this here, and you're dealing with something that's fairly detailed. What you're going to want to do before you open up the mold is wiggle it back and forth like this to loosen it very slightly so that it'll slide out. So we got our mold opened up, and now what I'm going to do is try to loosen this. This is one of several alternative uses that I have for my engraving tools, but anything that's long and pointy would do. The reason I like these is that, actually, what I really like is the one with the pointy tip. That one has a flat tip. What I like about these is that they have a flat edge and a point on the end. What you do is get these centered, put them into the wood, and just gently, gently lift like that. Okay. Then should be able to wiggle it out. I'm just barely touching this. Kind of the reverse of putting it in. Okay, got breaks. Got a little bit of loose stuff there along the edge. Nothing horrible. Should be easy enough to clean off. For what we're doing, anything loose that's likely to fall down inside the mold is very important. So what I did was, at these very, very small breaks along the edge, I blew while gently touching them with the paintbrush. You don't want to make them bigger, which of course is very easy to do, but you do want to clean off everything that's gonna fall out and get lodged deeper down when you pour the metal in. Okay, so that's pretty much clean now. Next step, we take this thing, and you see now why I didn't just carve it all as one. I'm gonna pop this out. And this is our guide on how to make the core. So the way you make the sand core, you take the wood core and you use it as a guide for how big a tube to make with this piece of aluminum can. Ideally, you want the two edges to be straight because we're going to put this down on the ground and pound on it. So if it's twisted, then the metal twists when you pound on it. I'm going to roll this to get it nice and tight, as tight as possible around the piece of wood. It needs to be in the center specifically, not down at one end, because then you're going to roll a funnel shape rather than a cylinder if you put it off to one end. It's completely covered in sand and grease, and so you need a fair amount of tape to do any good. But take this tape, keep it tight if possible. And then you do the same thing on the other side. And that tape's going to be fairly loose because this is one-handed. But then you go around and do the same thing again. Now we've got a tightly wrapped cylinder that is the same diameter as the inside diameter of the ring. So what you do is you start packing sand into there, and in the process you're going to shove the wood core down to one side. Now, delft clay as a material, there's a transition, which you probably already noted if you've used it before. That transition is where it switches from being a squishy thing to being a hard thing that cracks when you break it apart. Not cracks like rock, of course, but, you know, breaks up along a crack instead of smushing. And when we make this core, we want the delft clay to be tight enough within the core that if it were to do anything, it would crack rather than bend. Reason why is that this smushy delft clay, you'll notice, has a whole bunch of separate grains. And if you leave it like that in the mold, those grains are all going to break off and cause a bunch of little surface defects in the prongs of the ring, which is not where you want surface defects. Now, there's places where you can sand things off, but the prongs are pretty small to start with, and so they're not really one of those places. The other thing is, let me make sure that's down at the end where it should be. The other thing is, your natural inclination is going to be to grip the tube really tightly, but if you do that, then the tube is going to be an oval at one end and a circle at the other from being smushed by gripping. So if you grip it tightly, grip it down where the wood is so that it's going to be round at both ends. Another way of doing it is to give it a rotation every time you do it so that it's at least squished evenly. Oh, bother. I have made it so I can't tell where the line is. Oh well, we'll do it this way. Guess that works better anyway. And it should pop open, releasing a nice delft clay core. Now I want to be kind of careful with this and not get a bunch of crap all over it for the same reason. Anything that gets on it is a problem. I'm going to take our handy dandy calipers and measure this piece of wood. This is 23.4 millimeters. So the length of the core needs to be slightly smaller than that so that it can fit in. Let's say, take off that little bit there and aim for 18 maybe. We want it wide enough to cover the area, but not so wide that it scrapes on either side or is difficult to set. Maybe even a little bit smaller than 18. Yeah, that's about right there. Probably going to end up shaving some off either end anyway because it doesn't tend to split straight down. So on this side, we're going to cut from here. This side, going to cut from here. I think I'm going to intentionally angle this and then just visually clean it up on either side. Put this off to the side as a backup in a place where there's not a bunch of delft clay sitting around. Okay, let's measure that. Now down to hair less, but let's make it so that it's clean on either side. Oh, that's the reason why I'm having issues, because I'm not keeping the blade clean. Okay. Check the surface. It's actually going to be in contact with metal. All right, we're good. So this is about what you should end up with. Next aggravating thing, which takes a bit of fine motor control, is to start making the vents. Now, everything around here is covered in greasy sand, and you don't want loose grains of greasy sand or delft clay clogging up your vent holes. So make sure that the paper clip that you're using, or whatever you use, isn't covered in more bits of crap on it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to brace my hand here. I'm not going to do this on camera because I want to, the camera makes it a little bit harder to aim. But I'm going to poke a hole through each of these prongs in the mold, trying to keep it straight in, straight out, and then check to make sure there's nothing blocking it by visually looking through and making sure I can see daylight on the other side. This paper clip is 1 millimeter by 0.8 millimeters. That diameter seems to work. A little bit smaller would probably work, I would guess. Okay, so we got 5 points of light there. One on the top is kind of hard to see because it's at a different angle, but it's there. I will at least verbally give some tips on how to do things that require fine motor control. Muscles shake. It's what they do. So if you want to use something like this, have as many points of bracing and contact as possible. That's why I was doing this off camera. You don't want both of your hands free and suspended like this. You want, if you have to have something off the ground, hold it off like this rather than up in the air like this. And then I'll have my hand braced, preferably at multiple points, against the thing that I am doing work on, so that the point of whatever I'm using isn't shaking. Also, so that the paper clip isn't digging in and dragging out on the way in, what I normally do is I file the tip a little bit so that it's not sharp, but doesn't have a little lip that's going to drag on the way back. These things are clipped basically with a giant pair of pliers, and it tends to leave a little lip on one side. So if you smooth that down, it's not going to drag it on the way out. But there are our vent holes. Now we're going to make the other vent holes. There's a finite number of things that you have control over in terms of whether or not your casting is going to fill out and work, go all the way down to the end of the mold. We've already made our model, so the size and shape of the casting hole is already determined. We already know what metal we're going to use, or at least I'm planning on using argentium silver. So the way in which the metal melts is no longer something we have control over. Remaining things that you have control over are how high the sprue is, how much force is pushing the metal into the mold, and how aggressive the venting is. Also, how high a temperature you melt your silver to. So because we're making something that's kind of small, I'm going to be as aggressive as possible with the remaining factors that I have control over. Now we're going to make the sprue, which is just going to be a mess, and that's the way it is. So the closest you can be to correct, at least the closest that I've found out, is to make it as little of a mess as possible. So what I'm going to do I am going to make a guide hole here. And then going to make a larger guide hole. I think this thing's about the size that I want. Then what we do is we drill out an area for the metal to flow down through, like so. I normally try to go from this side because this side is just going to be a complete mess. Let it follow that guide hole. Okay, and as you can see, there is now a whole bunch of crud in there, which we worked so hard to avoid in all the other steps, and that's just going to have to be the way it is. I haven't found a way of getting around that. But I have found a way of recovering from it, which is to take something like this and to poke it through to clean up that space. Let me take this paintbrush and clean up any loose parts that I can as much as I can. Sorry, some things work out better if I'm doing it right in front of my face, which the camera kind of interferes with. Okay, so now we take this and push it there. It's going to cause a bulge at one end of the ring, but that's okay. And then more aggressively, take it from the other side, do the same thing. And that should pretty much take care of that loose sand at either side. I'm also going to do the same thing with the paintbrush handle, which is a little bit smaller. Force all those loose pieces of delft clay up against the edge of the sprue so they're not getting knocked down into the mold. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to build up this side so that the sprue is a little bit higher. I'm aiming for about 3 centimeters of height. Let me see, can I put this down on something? Maybe. Let's do it this way. I don't want that mold face to be in contact with the board, so I'm going to set these things in those grooves. Okay. So now what we do, now we got this built up, is make that hole bigger, because I don't know about you, but I find it very difficult to hit a target that small. And the way you do that is move it around this lip like that. Again, making sure that you're not leaving any loose pieces. The pencils or any other tool that you use are naturally going to pick up some loose pieces, so you're going to have to repeatedly clean it off while you're doing this so that they get picked up and taken away rather than picked up and then rolled back in. Want nice clean delft clay all the way down, which appears to be what we've got. Now what we're going to do is assemble all of these parts that we have so painstakingly made. So without touching the area that is actually going to come in contact with the metal, and making sure that there's no loose pieces that are about to get knocked down into the mold, I'm going to take this core, line this up, and drop it in. Cool. I rubber banded this together, which honestly makes more of a difference if you're pouring from the side like a normal human being. But I don't want all of that work to be wasted, so rubber bands it is. Okay, so now we melt our silver. Few words on setup. You want to have something that you can pour down into that's not too deep set, because you want to be able to hold your hand lower than the level of the mold. If you have to reach down to pour into the mold, like if you're casting inside a container full of sand or something like that, it's going to make it so you can't aim as accurately. For the amount of metal to use, it depends on what you're using to melt the metal, of course. But with a small torch like this, I try to stay to around half an ounce. I think I'm melting 15 grams here. The type of metal best is going to be a fresh casting grain, which I don't have at the moment. This is some stuff that I recycled by pouring it and melting it down and putting flux on it and pouring it into some water to clean it off. But fresh casting grain is going to have fewer oxides in it. So a word on temperature. This is not adequately melted. Like I said earlier, you only have a few factors that you have control over for whether or not a casting works. And one of them is the metal temperature. For it to be adequately melted, you want to have that slight shimmer on the surface, which happens at the point where the torch is blowing. It shows that it's thoroughly melted. You certainly don't want any lumps in it. It's getting there, but it's not quite there. The other thing, you want to start preheating the lip of the crucible that the metal is going to come out of, so that the metal doesn't cool on the crucible as it goes in. And then lastly, of course, you want to put a teeny bit of fresh flux on it to take up the oxides that are forming on the surface. Yeah, so now we got that slight shimmer on the surface. Make sure that the lip is fully preheated. Okay, now it's starting to look right. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. Well, smoke's coming out the bottom. That's a good sign. Moment of reveal. And we got 5 prongs. Yay, that's a good thing. Let me get some pliers. Or honestly, anything else that I can dig this thing out with. Don't want to touch it or the sand this early on. Alright, that's a successful cast. Now the rest of it's just going to be a whole lot of long work with the Dremel. Okay, that concludes the casting portion of the video. In the next video I'm going to be doing cleanup work and setting. Certainly watch it if you like it. I enjoyed doing it. But that's going to be less a tutorial, because lots of people can show you how to do cleanup work, and people who are better qualified than I am can show you how to do setting. In fact, in the next video I think I'm going to link a setting tutorial that I found particularly helpful. However, if you're interested in seeing how the final product was made, that video is linked down in the description. Hopefully see you there.